The nervous system. So before I get into the nervous system, let me just give you an idea about two terms. That is, one is the stimulus, which means the changes in the environmental condition which are detected by the receptors that is present in our body is known as the stimulus. And the changes that takes place in the individual because of that stimuli is what is known as the response, or action to a stimulus is what is known as the response. And any of this, to give the correct response, there should be a proper response from the various organs present in our body, which we call as the coordination. Okay, so get to know what is it, because I'll be using this term as stimulus, response, coordination. Yes, so I hope you understand. Stimulus means any change in the environment which is detected by the receptors of the particular individual, and the action to this stimulus is what is known as the response. And the coordination, or rather the proper functioning of the different organs to bring about a proper response is what is known as coordination. Okay. I take a little bit change from what the normal routine, the sequence that they have followed in the book. So let me just start off with the functions of the nervous system. So the function is to first gather the information. The information that is gathered, that is the changes that occurs inside and outside the bodies, those informations are gathered, and we call that as the sensory input. Next is the processing and interpreting of these sensory inputs, and to decide what action is to be taken, that is what we call as integration. And finally, the response to the stimuli, which could be the activating of a muscles or the glands, we call that as the motor output. So the functions of the nervous system is mainly sensory input, that is to collect the information, then integration, and finally the motor output. Okay, so the classification of the nervous system, I can put this under two broad heading. One is the central nervous system, abbreviated as CNS, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, abbreviated as PNS, which includes the nerves, especially the ones outside the brain and the spinal cord. So this is a diagram which shows the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and you have the messages which are going to various systems, and then from the sense organs there will be the information which is collected and going to the brain. We will be seeing that. Okay. The peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system can be put under two heading, that is the sensory division, which is also known as the efferent. So these are the nerve fibers that carry the information to the central nervous system, that means to the brain. And we have the motor division, which is the efferent nerve system, that includes the nerve fibers which carry the impulses away from the central nervous system. Okay. Now this can be into two types, that is the somatic system, which is the voluntary, and the autonomic system, which is the involuntary. So I was telling you about the sensory input. So it is the sensory nerves which carries the information to the brain, and it is the motor nerves which carries the information away from the brain to various organs. So one a diagram to show you one example. See, you see something, we see something, probably a dog coming. Yes, you get frightened. What is to be done? We immediately run. So what exactly is the action that is? So there is a sensory receptor, which is the eye. This sensory input goes to the brain. There is the integration and the motor output to the muscles of the leg, which is the effector organ, to run away from that. Do you get it? Okay. Next is the autonomic nervous system. This is actually the involuntary branch of the nervous system, also known as the visceral nervous system, as it regulates the function of the internal visceral organs. All the visceral organs, all the internal organs are regulated by this nervous system. So it is also known as the visceral nervous system. This is divided into two types, that is the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. Okay. Now coming to the nervous system. So what is the nervous system? It is made up of nervous tissues. Nervous tissue means what? It is the neurons plus the neuroglia plus the nerve fibers. All these makes up the nervous tissue. Now what is a neuron? Neuron is the nerve cell, which is the structural and the functional unit of the system. And this is the largest cell in the body. Now what is this function? It detects, it receives and transmits the stimuli. Yes? And then there are specialized cells which transmits these electrical impulses. So they are the neuroglia, which is also known as the glial cells, and they are the supporting cells. Now these do not initiate or conduct any nerve impulses. Okay. Then we have the nerve fibers, which is the long slender process of the neurons, and the nerve fibers bundle up together to form the nerves. So I hope you are clear with what is the nervous system. Okay. Now this is the structure of the neuron. Neuron, if I take the structure, you have the dendrite, there is the cell body, the axon and the synaptic terminals. So the dendrites, these fine branches from the cell body is what is called as the dendrite. This actually collects the changes or the information of the changes occurring in the environment. That's what I told you, within and outside environment. Yes, so these dendrites, they are highly branched. Now we have the cell body, which actually contains the nucleus and the other organelles like the mitochondria, ribosomes, etc. And it is from this cell body you have small projections which we call as the dendrites. Okay. Now one of the projection is very long and we call that as the axons. This axon actually conducts the impulse towards the synaptic terminals. So this collects via this, it moves towards the synaptic terminal. Now what is the synaptic terminal? Synaptic terminal is the end of this axon. Yes, axon, which actually transmits the information from one nerve cell to the next nerve cell. So I can here have another nerve cell here. So what will be here? It will be the dendrite of the next nerve cell. So the information from one nerve cell is transmitted to the next nerve cell. Do you get it? Okay. Yes. So in detail we'll see about the neuron. The major regions of the neuron. First you have the cyton or the cell body. We can call it as the perikaryon. Now this has nucleus. Yes, they have cytoplasm. The cytoplasm, since it's present in this, we call it as a neuroplasma. Then this is the metabolic center of the cell. Then there are large granular bodies called the Nissl granules present. And organelles like mitochondria, ribosomes, lysosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, etc. are present. But this lacks the ability to divide. Okay. Next comes the dendrite. So these are the branched cytoplasmic processes which extends from the cell body. Yes, and the function is to conduct the impulses towards the cell body. Then comes the axon. Axon is the slender elongated projection which ends in fine branches with a knob-like swelling. Can you see here? The knob-like swelling, and that we call it as the synaptic knob. The plasma membrane covering this axon, we call that as the axolemma, and the cytoplasm is called as the axoplasma. Now the function of this is to carry or conduct the impulse or carry the impulses away from the cell body. Yes, and this axon has a protective sheath which is called as the myelin sheath. Then over this myelin sheath you have some sort of a covering which we call as the neurilemma or the Schwann cells. And then this is not continuous. The myelin sheath, if you see, it is not continuous, but rather gaps are present, and we call this gap as the node of Ranvier. Okay. Yes. Next is synapse or the synaptic junction. So this is one nerve cell, this is another nerve cell. So this is called the synaptic junction. I showed you how the synaptic knob is there, which actually connect, or rather there will be a gap, but it transmits the impulse from this to the next dendrite. Do you get it? So the junction between the synaptic knob of an axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron is what is called as synapse. The transformation of the information across this junction is because it's not interconnected, but rather there is a gap. See, you can see like this. This is because of the release of a chemical substance called neurotransmitter, which actually carries the stimuli from one nerve cell to the next nerve cell. Okay. Now coming to the classification of neurons. Neurons can be classified on different bases. First, on the basis of the structure, we can classify it as unipolar neuron when there is only one nerve processes. Do you get it? Which acts both as a dendrite and the axon. Now, having known the structure, you know how it is. Yes? So, they will have only one nerve process, and this acts both as a dendrite and the axon. Then you have bipolar neurons where you have two nerve processes. One is the axon and the other is the dendrite. And you have multipolar neuron where you have number of dendrites and an axon. So this is based on the structure. Coming to the classification based on the function, we can classify them as sensory neurons, also known as the efferent. I told you, those which carry the messages to the brain. They carry the impulses from the sensory receptors, from the from eye, nose, skin, whichever is the organ. Then they could be cutaneous sense organs also. Now the receptors, they detect stretch or tension. So the changes that occurs. Then we have the association known as the connector, and motor, which is known as the efferent neurons, which actually carries the impulses from the central nervous system to the different parts of the body. Okay, so this is the efferent transmission, this red one, which is actually the motor, and the blue one is the efferent, which is the sensory. So from the receptor, it carries the information to the brain. Yes, that is via the spinal cord moves to the brain, and from the brain the information is carried to the different effector organs. Okay, now based on the presence or absence of the myelin sheath, we can classify these neurons as either myelinated nerve fiber. So the term itself says that such nerve fibers do have this sheath called as a myelin sheath, and non-myelinated nerve fibers when they lack the myelin sheath. Okay. Now, how does these neurons conduct these impulses or communicate at the synapses? Is how do they do it? So the dendrite collects the information through the cell body. It passes via this axon, reaches the end, that is the synaptic knob, and where we have the dendrite of the next nerve cell also, So this junction is what is called as synaptic or synapse. I have highlighted this. So this is the synapse. This portion is a synaptic knob, and within the synaptic knob you do have certain vesicles called as the synaptic vesicles, and at the end of this there are cleft which we call as the synaptic cleft. So when the information reaches here, what happens is these vesicles, they will fuse with the plasma membrane, and we have the neurotransmitter, which is the chemical substance that is released into this synaptic cleft. Do you get it? And these neurotransmitter binds to the receptor on the dendrites of the neighboring or the adjacent nerve cells. Yes, and it communicates. Do you get it? Yes, so this is what actually happens. Fine. Next is the reflex action. Now, what is this reflex action? Reflex action means, suppose I can give you two examples. You are unaware there is a sharp nail on the table. You just happen to place your hand, it's immediately you pull your hand, or something gets into your eyes, you immediately blink, or a hot object, the moment you touch it, you just pull away. This is what is called as the reflex arc or the reflex action. So reflex means it is a rapid, predictable and involuntary response to the stimuli. It's not under our control. The moment you touch it, I am not aware of it, but the moment I touch it, when you happen to get a shock. So we just happen to pull our hands. Yes. So these are the involuntary, a rapid, predictable, involuntary response to a stimuli. And what do you mean by reflex arc? That is the route that this message takes from the sensory neuron to an effector organ is what is known as the reflex arc. So this is the skin. I've given a diagram here, a skin. The example that I told you, if a nail pricks, you happen to walk barefooted, and then supposing a nail pricks, yes, the skin. So stimulus at the distal ends of the neurons, which is the receptor. Now once it pricks, I get to know it's a pain and I pull my hand. But by the time I do this, there are some action which is going on, which is all in a fraction of a second. That is, these impulses are carried via the sensory neuron. It moves to the spinal cord and then to the brain, where you have the integration center, and there is the association to say what response it has to do, and the motor neuron carries it back to this effector organ, and that makes me pull my hand. Do you get it? Okay. Yes, next we will come to the organ of the central nervous system, that is the human brain. The human brain, not much of, because you are aware of it, I'm not going into all that, I'm directly getting into the structure. It has three membranes. The dura mater, which is the outermost thick fibrous membrane. Then we have the arachnoid membrane, which is the middle thin vascular membrane and acts like a cushion. So vascular means there is the supply of the blood vessels. And finally I have the pia mater, which is the innermost thin delicate membrane, which is richly vascularized. Yes, so the three membranes, you should be clear of all these parts: dura membrane, arachnoid membrane, pia mater, and I have given you the function of this. Okay, now the human brain can be divided into three parts, that is known as the forebrain, the midbrain and the hindbrain. Okay, we'll see what the forebrain. So the diagram is also here. Yes, coming to the forebrain. Forebrain, I can divide them into cerebrum and diencephalon. Diencephalon into the dorsal portion, which I call as the thalamus, and a ventral portion which is known as the hypothalamus. Okay, now we'll see about the forebrain, which is the under which we have the cerebrum. Yes, so the cerebrum, it occupies 2/3 of the entire brain. 2/3 of the entire brain is made up of, or rather occupied by, the cerebrum. And this cerebrum has two parts. I hope it is clear to you. You have two parts, that is the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. We call that as left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere, with a median cleft, some sort of a partition or a depression. The two hemispheres, they are connected by means of corpus callosum. So you can see over here, this is the right hemisphere, this is the left hemisphere, and I have the corpus callosum which connects these two hemispheres. Do you get it? Okay, and it's a thick nerve fiber. Now the outer portion of the hemisphere is the cerebral cortex. it be the right or the left, it is the cerebral cortex, which has the grey matter. The inner portion of the hemisphere is the cerebral medulla and has the white matter. The cortex, they are folded into elevations, which we call as gyri, and the depressions known as the sulci. Yes, so outer portion is the cerebral cortex, the inner is the medulla. Now we are saying about the cortex. Cortex, you can see how it is. See, you have depressions, you have projections. Yes, so this elevation we call them as the gyri, and these depressions are known as the sulci. The main aim to have this is to increase the surface area. Okay. Now the cerebral, this portion has 4 lobes. We call them as the cerebral lobes, which includes, see, I have marked it with different colors over here. You have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Okay. Now, each of this lobe, they have their own function. Damage to any of these lobe can affect the specific functions, yes, which includes thinking, intelligence, conscious, memory, imagination, willpower, reasoning. So each of these areas do have a specific function, and a damage to any of this would affect that particular function. Okay. Next is thalamus. So in the cerebral medulla, this is the cerebral medulla. Again, I have marked this here. Yes, which conducts it is actually the conducting center for the sensory and the motor signaling. I told you how the information comes. So you have a sensory coming in, and then it has to pass via the motor. So that signaling, that conduction actually takes place in this region, and it is the relay center. Next is the hypothalamus, which is at the base of the thalamus. This is the thermoregulatory center of the body. So the temperature regulation is done by this. And it also controls the involuntary actions like hunger, thirst, sleep, fear, anger, etc. And they also controls the secretion of hormones from the anterior pituitary glands. Next comes the midbrain. The midbrain is between the thalamus and the hindbrain. There are 4 rounded bodies which are present, known as the corpora quadrigemina. Yes, I have marked it over here, the corpora quadrigemina, and they mainly control the visual and the auditory reflexes. Coming to the hindbrain can be divided into the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum, this is the second after the cerebrum, this is the second largest part of the brain. It has 2 hemispheres with a middle vermis. Yes, again the diagram is over here with the vermis, and this mainly coordinates the voluntary movements of the body and also the body balancing. Then we have the pons, which is actually a bridge of the nerve fibers that connects the lobes of the cerebellum, and this conducts the signal between the cerebellum, spinal cord, midbrain, and the cerebrum, and it controls respiration and the sleep cycle. Finally, we have the medulla oblongata, which is the posterior most part of the brain. It connects the spinal cord with the brain. Then various activities like the cardiac, the respiratory, and the vasomotor centers, they are regulated by this. Then it also regulates vomiting and salivation. The brainstem. Brainstem is that portion which attaches to the spinal cord. Yes. So the parts of the brainstem includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Coming to the spinal cord, if you take, it extends from the medulla oblongata to the first lumbar vertebrae. Yes, this is covered by membrane known as meninges. The posterior end, they taper like thread, and we call that as the filum termini. Then cerebrospinal fluid in the central canal. There is a fluid which is within this membrane, which is known as the cerebrospinal fluid. And the grey matter is H-shaped. Yes, so this has a posterior horn and an anterior horn. Now, bundle of the fibers passing from the posterior horn is what is known as the efferent root or the dorsal root, and the bundle of fibers passing out of the anterior. This anterior, see this I have put it here, it is more like a H. Yes, so we call that as the anterior horn is known as those bundle of fibers which is coming out of the anterior horn is known as the ventral or the efferent root. Now both these root, they join to form the spinal nerves, and that controls the reflex actions of the body. The cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that mostly supplies the head and the neck, and they are numbered in order front to back. Okay, so most of them are mixed nerves, but 3 are sensory only. So you have sensory nerves, motor nerves, and then the mixed nerves. So most of them are mixed nerve, but there are 3 which is only sensory. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Remember them. Spinal nerves, they are 31 pairs. They have the dorsal sensory root and the ventral motor root. Dorsal spinal root, which carries impulses towards the spinal cord, and the ventral spinal root, which carries impulses away from the spinal cord. Yes, so with that I am completing this chapter.